Ma'am, can you explain what you're doing here?
I'm shopping. This is a boutique, isn't it?
You've been walking around for a while. Why don't you set those dresses down and leave before this turns into something
Excuse
bigger?
me, I haven't broken any
She's
rules.
been lingering for over 10
shopping.
minutes. It's making...
You were looking at the exact moment a luxury boutique became a crime scene, not because of theft, but because of prejudice. Through an Axon Body 3 camera lens, a woman in a camel coat stands frozen, designer dresses clutched in her hands, as an off-duty officer demands she put them down. His wife, hiding behind a clothing rack, had called him, claiming a black shopper looked suspicious. But what this couple didn't know was that the woman they were humiliating didn't just have the right to be there. She signed the paychecks of everyone in the building. This 8-second judgment would cost him 8 years in prison, cost her everything she built in her community, and cost the city $700,000 in the lawsuit that exposed a pattern of racial profiling that had gone unchecked for years. Welcome back to the channel. Today's story is about the price of assumptions. We're diving into the case of Selena Caldwell, a self-made millionaire who built a $3 million fashion empire from 16-hour workdays and refused to let anyone tell her she didn't belong, until the day someone tried to arrest her for belonging too well. Before we break down the body cam footage that became Exhibit A in a federal civil rights case, drop a comment. Have you ever been treated like a criminal while doing something completely legal? Hit that like button if you believe accountability should come with consequences, and subscribe because stories like this need to be told. Selena Caldwell didn't look like a CEO that Saturday afternoon, and that was exactly the point. After 12 years of building Nouveau Luxe from a single storefront in Brooklyn to 5 locations across 3 states, she learned that the best way to understand your business was to disappear into it. No entourage, no announcement, just her, a camel coat she'd owned since her waitressing days, and the kind of quiet that only comes when nobody knows you're watching. The Madison Avenue flagship hummed with the particular silence of expensive things. Marble floors caught the September light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows. A Sade song played low enough to feel like a secret. Selena moved through the space she designed, running her fingers along a rack of evening wear, checking the spacing between hangers, the way the fabrics caught the light. This was the routine she developed over 16-hour days that had once defined her life, back when she was the girl hemming dresses in her grandmother's basement and dreaming of something bigger than survival. She paused at a gold sequined gown that shimmered like liquid under the boutique lighting. The stitching along the bodice was flawless, exactly the standard she demanded from her manufacturers. Next to it hung a sleek black slip dress, deceptively simple, the kind of piece that whispered wealth instead of shouting it. Selena lifted both from the rack, feeling the weight of the hangers in her hands, studying the drape of the fabric. She'd been doing this for so long that quality control had become instinct, a language her hands spoke fluently. To anyone watching, she might have looked like just another high-end shopper inspecting potential purchases, but Selena was doing something else entirely. She was reading her empire in thread count and seam allowances, making sure that every detail matched the vision that had pulled her out of a life where 16-hour days meant barely making rent, not building generational wealth. The boutique was nearly empty this afternoon, just how she liked it for these unannounced visits. One customer near the front, a sales associate named Tasha behind the counter organizing bags, the general manager Marcus out on his lunch break. Everything was exactly as it should be. Selena held the dresses up to the light one more time, noting a barely perceptible loose thread on the gold gown that she'd have to mention to quality control, and then turned toward the fitting rooms. She had no idea that in less than 10 minutes, those 2 dresses would be on the floor, her hands would be in handcuffs, and the entire trajectory of her life would pivot on the assumptions of a woman she'd never met. Diane Kowalski had been browsing the clearance rack near the entrance for 20 minutes, but she hadn't actually looked at a single piece of clothing in the last 5. Her attention had shifted the moment Selena walked in, and now she was pretending to examine a blouse she'd already rejected twice, while watching the other woman's every move in the security mirror mounted above the register. Diane wore a beige blazer over dark jeans, an outfit that suggested country club lunches and PTA meetings, the kind of uniform that came with unexamined confidence. She told herself she was just being observant, just paying attention to her surroundings the way the Neighborhood Watch Facebook group was always encouraging. But the truth was simpler and uglier than that. The truth was that when Selena walked in with that camel coat and white turtleneck, Diane's brain made a calculation it wasn't supposed to make out loud. This woman didn't belong. Selena lifted the gold sequined gown, and Diane's eyes narrowed. The way she was inspecting it, turning it over her hands, holding it up to the light, Diane had convinced herself she was watching someone case the place. Look how carefully she's examining it. She's figuring out how to remove the tags. The fact that Selena was doing exactly what any discerning shopper would do in a high-end boutique didn't register. Diane had already written the story, and now she was just collecting evidence to support it. When Selena picked up the black slip dress and held both garments against her body, Diane actually took a step backward, positioning herself partially behind a clothing rack. The movement was instinctive, the physical manifestation of a decision she was already making. She pulled out her phone, glanced once more at Selena through the mirror, and then did what she'd done 3 times in the past 18 months when she felt this particular combination of suspicion and self-righteousness. She called her husband. "Dennis, it's me," she said quietly, her voice tight with manufactured urgency. "I'm at that boutique on Madison, the one near the good coffee place. There's a woman in here acting really suspicious, and I think she's about to steal something. Can you come? I don't feel safe." On the other end of the line, Officer Dennis Kowalski didn't ask what made the woman suspicious. He didn't ask what she was doing that seemed criminal. He'd been married to Diane long enough to know what suspicious meant when she used that particular tone. and he'd spent enough years in uniform to have absorbed the same assumptions his wife carried. When your wife says she doesn't feel safe, you don't question it. You respond. I'm 5 minutes away. Don't approach her. I'm coming. Diane ended the call and slipped her phone back into her purse, feeling the particular satisfaction that comes from believing she'd prevented a crime. She didn't notice Tasha watching her from behind the counter with a confused expression. She didn't see Selena moving toward the fitting rooms, completely unaware that she'd been categorized as a threat. And she certainly didn't consider that the story she'd just told her husband was built on nothing more substantial than bias dressed up as intuition. Dennis Kowalski pulled up outside the boutique 4 minutes later, parking in a loading zone with the casual authority of someone who'd worn a badge for 17 years. He reached for the Axon Body 3 camera clipped to his civilian jacket. Even off-duty, he kept it close, and activated it with a practiced motion. The red light blinked on, and somewhere in a cloud server, a timestamp began recording. 2018-09-08, 2025-01. The camera saw what Dennis saw, the gleaming storefront of Nouveau Luxe, the kind of place where dresses cost more than most people's monthly rent, and through the window, a black woman in a camel coat holding 2 expensive garments. Dennis didn't see a CEO. He saw exactly what his wife had described, and he walked through those doors ready to be the hero of a story that hadn't actually happened yet. Diane had positioned herself behind a circular rack of silk blouses, the kind of hiding spot that felt covert, but really was just theatrical. From there, she could watch Selena without being obvious about it, or at least that's what she told herself. Her phone was already in her hand again, thumb hovering over the screen as she rehearsed what she'd say if she needed to make another call, this time to 911 instead of just Dennis. But no, Dennis would handle it. Dennis always handled it. She met him 15 years ago at a charity fundraiser, back when he was a rookie cop with that particular swagger that came from carrying a gun legally. He'd made her feel protected then, and he still did now, even if that protection was sometimes just validation for the stories she told herself about the world. They built a life on mutual reinforcement, a marriage where neither questioned the other's judgment, because to do so would mean questioning their own. When Diane had called him about the suspicious jogger last year, the black man in medical scrubs, who turned out to be a cardiologist running before his shift, Dennis hadn't questioned her. When she'd reported the threatening teenager who was just delivering newspapers, Dennis had backed her version of events, even after the kid's parents showed up with his route paperwork. And now, watching Selena inspect those dresses with what Diane had decided was criminal intent, Diane knew Dennis would believe her again. He always did. Through her phone screen, she snapped a photo of Selena holding the garments, though she wasn't sure what she'd do with it. Maybe evidence, something to show the other neighborhood watch members later, proof that she'd been right to call. The flash was off, but her hands shook slightly with adrenaline, the chemical rush of believing you're witnessing a crime in progress. She didn't notice that Selena had simply draped both dresses over her arm
and was headed toward the fitting rooms, the completely normal action of someone preparing to try on clothes they were considering purchasing. The boutique door chimed and Dennis walked in. Diane's shoulders relaxed immediately. He was here. Everything would be fine now. She watched as he scanned the room with the systematic efficiency of someone trained to assess threats, his eyes landing immediately on Selena. The Axon Body 3 camera on his jacket was already recording, the small lens capturing everything from his perspective. The marble floors, the racks of designer clothing, and centered in the frame, a woman in a camel coat who had no idea her next 60 seconds would change everything. Dennis didn't announce himself. He didn't ask questions. He made his assessment the moment he walked through the door, and 17 years of wearing a badge had taught him to trust his instincts, even when those instincts were just inherited bias wearing the uniform of professional judgment. Tasha saw him coming and started to step forward, her face showing confusion. There was no security issue she was aware of, and Dennis wasn't part of any protective detail she'd been briefed on. Something in her body language made her hesitate. That moment of hesitation would haunt her later, a fraction of a second when she could have said something but didn't. And by the time she decided to speak up anyway, it was already too late. Dennis crossed the boutique floor in 6 strides, his reflection fragmenting across multiple mirrors, creating the illusion of several men converging on one woman. The camera on his chest captured it all, the timestamp ticking forward with mechanical indifference. 2025-01, 2025-02, 2025-03. Each second was another step closer to the moment that would end his career and expose a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Selena heard the footsteps behind her and turned, the gold and black dresses still draped over her arm, her expression shifting from the focused concentration of quality control to polite curiosity. She was used to customers approaching her in her own stores sometimes, asking questions or complimenting the selection, and for a split second she thought this might be one of those moments. "Ma'am, put the dresses down." The words hit the air like a door slamming. Selena's face froze, her mind trying to process a command that made no sense in the context of what she was doing. She looked at Dennis, then at the camera on his chest, then back at his face, searching for some explanation that would make this interaction logical. "I'm shopping," she said slowly, her grip tightening on the hangers. "Is there a problem?" Behind the clothing rack, Diane watched with her phone still in her hand, her expression caught between vindication and uncertainty. This was what she'd wanted, wasn't it? For someone to take action? Watching it unfold, she felt a flicker of something else. Question she couldn't quite articulate. What if I'm wrong? She pushed the thought away. She wasn't wrong. She couldn't be wrong. Dennis was here, and Dennis didn't waste time on false alarms. The story she told herself was true because it had to be true, because the alternative was too uncomfortable to consider. Dennis took another step forward, his voice dropping into that particular register of authority that police officers learn in training, the tone that says compliance isn't a request. People like you make this environment unsafe. The words hung in the air, recorded by the Axon Body 3 in perfect digital clarity, the timestamp marking the exact moment when assumption became accusation. Selena's eyes widened, not with fear yet, but with the dawning realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding she could clear up with a simple explanation. This was something else entirely. People like me? She repeated, her voice steady despite the adrenaline now flooding her system. What exactly do you mean by that? Dennis had already moved past the conversation. In his mind, he'd given her a chance to comply, and she'd chosen to argue instead. That was enough. The script he was following didn't leave room for nuance, and he'd followed it so many times before that the next steps came automatically. The body cam footage would later show exactly what happened next. Every frame admissible in court, every word transcribed for legal documents that would be read by judges and lawyers and jury members who would watch this moment over and over until it was seared into public memory. But in the actual moment, standing on that marble floor with soft music still playing in the background, Selena experienced it not as something that would become evident, but as a violation happening in real time. "Ma'am, put the dresses down," Dennis repeated, his hand moving to his belt where his off-duty weapon rested. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, a physical reminder of the power imbalance in play. "I'm not gonna ask again." Selena's hands tightened on the hangers, an involuntary response that had nothing to do with defiance and everything to do with the surreal nature of what was happening. The gold sequin gown caught the light, throwing small reflections across the walls, beautiful and absurd against the backdrop of this confrontation. The black slip dress hung next to it, elegant and simple, both pieces now transformed from merchandise into evidence of a crime that didn't exist.
"I don't understand what's happening," Selena said, her voice taking on the careful precision of someone who knows they're being recorded. "I'm a customer in this store. I was about to try these on. What law am I breaking?" From behind the counter, Tasha finally found her voice. "Sir, I don't think—" Dennis cut her off with a gesture, not even looking in her direction. His focus remained locked on Selena, and in his mind, he was still the hero of the story, still the officer responding to a legitimate concern from his wife, still doing his job the way he'd been trained. The fact that nothing illegal had occurred didn't register, because he'd already decided what he was witnessing. "These are expensive items," Dennis said, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand. "You're holding them in a way that suggests intent to conceal. Your behavior matches known patterns of retail theft. I'm asking you to set them down and present identification." Selena felt something shift in her chest, a cold clarity cutting through the confusion. This wasn't about the dresses. This had never been about the dresses. This was about who Dennis thought she was, what he assumed she was doing here, why he believed she didn't belong. She'd spent 12 years building an empire specifically so she'd never have to explain her right to exist in spaces like this. And now she was standing in her own store being accused of stealing her own merchandise. "I'm the owner of this boutique," Selena said, the words coming out steady despite the rage building behind them. "My name is Selena Caldwell, and you're standing in my store accusing me of stealing my own inventory." The body cam captured Dennis's reaction perfectly. The slight smile, the shake of his head, the exhalation of breath that suggested he'd heard this before and hadn't believed it then either. In his 17 years on the force, he'd learned that everyone claimed to be someone important when they were caught. Everyone had an excuse. Everyone thought they could talk their way out of consequences. "That's what they all say," he replied, and the dismissiveness in his tone was almost worse than the accusation itself. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to—" "I'm telling you the truth," Selena interrupted, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "Call the general manager. Call anyone who works here. They'll confirm it." Dennis glanced at Tasha, who was now standing frozen behind the counter, her face showing the particular terror of someone caught between two authorities, her boss and a police officer. No good option for intervention. "Is that true?" he asked her. Tasha opened her mouth, and for a fraction of a second she saw the hesitation in her eyes, the calculation of risk, the fear of getting involved. When Tasha finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I just started last week. I've never met the owner." It was technically true. Selena had been traveling to the Philadelphia location during Tasha's training week, but it was also the worst possible answer, the kind of statement that sounded like evasion even when it was honest. Dennis's expression hardened, his patience officially exhausted. "Last chance," he said to Selena. "Put down the dresses and show me ID, or I'm placing you under arrest for attempted theft and obstruction." Selena looked at the garments in her hands, at the store she'd built, at the camera recording every second of this humiliation, and made a decision that would later be analyzed by every lawyer involved in the case. She held on to the dresses, not because she was being defiant, but because putting them down felt like admitting guilt for something she hadn't done, like participating in the narrative Dennis had already written for her. "I'm not putting them down," she said quietly, "because I haven't done anything wrong, and I'm not showing you ID because I don't have to. I'm not under arrest, I'm not suspected of any legitimate crime, and you have no legal authority to demand anything from me." She was right, of course. Everything she just said was legally accurate, but being right doesn't always protect you, and Dennis had already moved past the point where facts mattered. In his mind, her refusal to comply was proof of guilt. Her knowledge of her rights was evidence of criminal sophistication, and her insistence on her identity was just another lie he'd heard too many times before. "Turn around," Dennis said, reaching for his handcuffs. And that's when everything accelerated. The dresses hit the floor first, the gold sequin gown spreading across the marble like liquid, the black slip dress crumpling beside it, both of them falling in a way that would become iconic when the body cam footage went viral weeks later. Her hands were wrenched behind her back with a force that made her stumble forward, catching herself against the display table, where $800 scarves were arranged in careful spirals. "You're making a mistake," Selena said, her voice still controlled, but edged with something sharper now, the kind of fury that comes from being completely powerless in a situation that shouldn't be happening. "I'm telling you, I own this building. I own this entire company. You're arresting your employer's landlord." Dennis wasn't listening anymore. The metallic click of handcuffs closing around Selena's wrists was recorded in perfect clarity by the Axon Body 3, the sound sharp against the background of that Sade song still playing from the boutique speakers. The timestamp read 2018-08-08-2025-47, marking the exact moment that a routine Saturday afternoon transformed into federal evidence. "You have the right to remain silent," Dennis began, his voice taking on the mechanical rhythm of a script he'd recited hundreds of times. But Selena wasn't silent. "My general manager's name is Marcus Holloway. He's on lunch. He'll be back in 15 minutes. My attorney is Keisha Chen at Morrison & Partners. My stores are registered to Nouveau Luxe LLC. This is my third location. I have a Forbes profile from last year." "Ma'am, you need to stop talking," Dennis said, tightening his grip on her arm and steering her to the exit. The handcuffs were too tight, cutting into her wrists in a way that would leave marks she'd photograph later for evidence. But complaining about them now would just be added to the list of things Dennis was interpreting as resistance. From behind the counter, Tasha watched with wide eyes, her phone now in her hand, but not yet raised, not yet recording, still frozen in that space between action and inaction that would define her own role in this story. Near the entrance, Diane Kowalski had emerged from behind the clothing rack, her face showing a mixture of vindication and growing uncertainty, as she watched her husband manhandle a woman who was still insisting she owned the place. "Dennis, maybe you should—" She didn't finish the sentence, not finish it because she wasn't sure what she was suggesting. Call someone, check her story, wait for the manager. All of those options meant admitting that maybe she'd been wrong, that maybe her instincts weren't as reliable as she'd always believed, and that was too big a concession to make while still standing in the store where she'd made the call. Dennis didn't even acknowledge his wife's voice. He was focused on the task at hand, moving Selena toward the exit with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. In his mind, this was already over. The arrest made, the situation controlled, the threat neutralized. He'd fill out the paperwork back at the station. His wife would give a witness statement. And by Monday, this would just be another line item in his arrest record, unremarkable and unquestioned. "You're destroying your career," Selena said, her voice dropping to something colder now, all traces of pleading gone, "and you're doing it on camera." For just a moment, Dennis hesitated. Something in her tone cut through his certainty, a note of absolute conviction that made him glance down at the woman in handcuffs and wonder for the first time if he'd miscalculated. But the moment passed quickly, buried under years of training that taught him to trust his initial assessment, to believe in his authority, to never show doubt once you've committed to an action. They were 5 feet from the door when Marcus Holloway walked back in from his lunch break. Marcus had been thinking about the chicken sandwich he'd just eaten. Too much mayo, not enough pickle, and wondering if he should grab coffee before heading back when he pushed through the boutique door and saw his boss in handcuffs being dragged across the floor by a man with a camera on his chest. For a full 2 seconds, his brain refused to process the image, kept trying to reconfigure it into something that made sense. Selena doing some kind of security drill, Selena filming content for their social media, Selena involved in anything other than what this obviously was. What the And then his training kicked in, the professional polish of a general manager who worked retail long enough to know that how you handle the next 30 seconds can make or break everything. "Stop! That's the CEO!" His voice cracked on the last word, loud enough that it carried through the whole store, bounced off those marble floors, and registered on the body cam with perfect clarity. Marcus was already pulling out his phone, fingers fumbling with the lock screen, trying to pull up the Forbes article, the company website, anything that would prove what he was saying. Dennis stopped moving, but didn't release his grip on Selena's arm. "Who are you?" "I'm Marcus Holloway. I'm the general manager of this location, and that woman you're arresting is Selena Caldwell, the founder and CEO of Nouveau Luxe. She owns this building. She owns all of this." Marcus gestured wildly at the space around him, his voice climbing into a register of panic that made it clear he understood exactly how catastrophic this situation was. "He's been telling me the same story," Dennis said, his voice still carrying that dismissive edge, though his expression had started to shift. "Stealing?" Marcus's voice went up another octave. "She's not. She was doing her monthly quality check. She does this at all our locations. She comes in unannounced to inspect the merchandise." Marcus finally got his phone to cooperate and shoved it directly into the body cam's lens, so close that the footage would later show his screen in perfect detail, Selena's Forbes profile. The headline, reading "From Waitress to Millionaire, How Selena Caldwell Built a Fashion Empire," her professional headshot showing her in the same camel coat she was wearing now. Dennis's face went through a series of expressions that the body cam captured in brutal detail. Confusion, recognition, and finally, the color-draining realization of someone who understands they've just made a career-ending mistake. His grip on Selena's arm loosened, and he took a step back, his eyes moving from the phone to Selena, to the store around them, as if seeing it all for the first time. She said," Dennis started, but couldn't seem to finish any sentence. His eyes found Diane, still standing near the entrance, and something passed between them. A wordless communication between two people who just realized they'd built their certainty on nothing but assumptions. "She?" Marcus said, following Dennis's gaze to Diane. "Wait, did she call this in?" Diane's face went red, her hand instinctively moving to her purse as if she might find some escape route there.
I thought she looked suspicious. I was just being cautious. Suspicious how? Marcus demanded, his voice taking on an edge that suggested he already knew the answer. Suspicious because she was black? Suspicious because you decided she didn't belong here? Suspicious because you'd rather call the cops than mind your own fucking business? I was trying to help, Diane protested, but her voice had lost all its conviction. She looked at Dennis, then at Selena, then back at her husband, and in that moment she understood that help had never been what she was offering. She'd been offering judgment, prejudice dressed up as concern, and now it was being exposed in real time. Selena stood perfectly still, her hand still cuffed behind her back, her expression unreadable. She was watching Dennis, watching Diane, watching Marcus spiral into protective rage on her behalf, and she was making calculations, not about whether to press charges, that was already decided, but about exactly how she wanted this to play out, how to turn this violation into something that would mean nobody else had to stand in handcuffs in their own store ever again. Take these off, she said quietly, her voice cutting through Marcus's tirade. Take them off, and then both of you get out of my store. Dennis's hand shook as he reached for his keys, fumbling with the handcuffs, taking 3 tries to get them unlocked. When they finally clicked open, Selena brought her hands forward and rubbed her wrists where the metal had left deep red marks. She didn't look at Dennis as he backed away, didn't acknowledge Diane's stammered attempt at an apology. She just stood there in her camel coat, in her store, surrounded by the clothes she designed and the space she'd built, and let the silence do the work. You'll hear from my lawyer, Selena said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of an absolute promise. Both of you, get out. Dennis and Diane left without another word, the body cam recording their exit, the timestamp marking the moment when their lives changed just as much as Selena's had. The boutique door closed behind them with a gentle chime, absurdly polite given what had just happened. Marcus started to speak, started to apologize for not being there, for preventing this, but Selena held up one hand to stop him. Call Keisha Chin. Tell her I need her here in an hour. And Marcus, save that body cam footage. We're going to need every frame. Keisha Chin arrived in 43 minutes, walking into Nouveau Luxe with the purposeful stride of someone who'd built her reputation on cases exactly like this one. She was carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression that suggested she'd already mentally filed the lawsuit before she'd even heard the full story. Marcus had given her the basics over the phone, but seeing Selena, seeing the marks on her wrists, the way she was holding herself with that particular rigidity that comes from trying not to fall apart, transformed this from a potential case into a personal mission. Tell me everything, Keisha said, setting her portfolio on the counter and pulling out a legal pad. And I mean everything. What you were wearing, what you were thinking, every word that was said. We're going to build a timeline that's airtight. Selena walked her through it, Marcus corroborating details, Tasha adding what she'd witnessed from behind the counter. The story that emerged was damning in its simplicity. A black woman shopping in her own store, profiled by another customer, arrested by that customer's husband, who never once bothered to verify any facts before putting her in handcuffs. And all of it recorded in perfect digital clarity on an Axon body cam camera that Dennis probably thought was protecting him, but was actually documenting his liability. The body cam footage is the key, Keisha said, making notes as Selena talked. That's what makes this case different from the hundreds of others where it's just word against word. We have video evidence of every moment, every interaction, every expression on his face when he realized he'd made a mistake. And more importantly, we have his words on record. People like you make this environment unsafe. That's not just profiling, Selena. That's prosecutable. Marcus had been pacing during the entire conversation, his anger still simmering, but now he stopped and turned to Keisha. What about the wife? She's the one who called it in. She's the one who decided Selena was suspicious for no reason, except he didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Diane Kowalski, Keisha said, writing the name down. We'll subpoena her phone records, get the exact time of that call, match it to the body cam timestamp, and then we're going to do a very thorough background check on both of them, because in my experience, people who do this once have done it before. She was right. Within 48 hours of retaining Morrison and partners, Keisha's investigators had compiled a file on Dennis Kowalski that read like a pattern and practice manual for racial profiling. 15 excessive force complaints over his 17-year career, 13 of them involving people of color. 8 false arrest claims, 6 settled quietly by the city before they could go to trial. A disciplinary record that showed consistent issues with judgment and de-escalation. Bureaucratic language that meant he had a habit of seeing threats when none existed. And Diane's record was almost worse because it was civilian. 3 documented calls to 911 about suspicious people in her neighborhood, all of whom turned out to be black professionals going about their completely legal daily lives. The cardiologist out for a run, the newspaper delivery kid, and now Selena shopping in her own store. Each incident carefully documented by the 911 transcripts, each one showing a pattern of someone who'd appointed herself the guardian of her community without ever examining who she thought needed guarding against. They're married, Keisha said during a strategy session in her office 3 days later, spreading the investigation files across her conference table. That's not just an interesting detail, that's conspiracy. The wife makes the call based on racial bias. The husband responds with excessive force. They're acting as a team, and that makes both of them liable. Selena studied the files, seeing her own experience reflected in the complaints of others, understanding that what had happened to her wasn't an isolated mistake, but the latest iteration of something that had been going on for years. The rage she'd felt in those handcuffs crystallized into something sharper and more focused. Determination. I want all of it in the lawsuit, Selena said. Every complaint,
Every settlement, every time the city chose to pay out rather than hold him accountable. This isn't just about what happened to me. This is about a system that protected him long enough for him to keep doing this to other people. Keisha nodded, already making notes. Civil rights violation under Section 1983, false arrest, intentional infliction of emotional distress, assault and battery, and we'll add the city as a defendant for their failure to supervise and their pattern of covering up his misconduct. We're asking for actual damages, punitive damages, and policy changes. We're going to make this expensive enough that they can't ignore it. But the civil suit was just one piece. Keisha had also been in contact with the district attorney's office, and after reviewing the body cam footage and Dennis's service record, they'd made a decision that was rarer than it should have been. They're bringing criminal charges, official misconduct, false imprisonment, and because the body cam showed Dennis's hand moving towards his weapon during the confrontation, assault with intent to intimidate. They're offering him a plea deal, Keisha told Selena during another meeting. 2 years if he agrees to resign from the force and never work in law enforcement again. Absolutely not, Selena said immediately. We go to trial. I want a jury to see that footage. I want them to hear him say, people like you. I want this to be public. Keisha smiled, the expression of someone who'd been hoping to hear exactly that. Then we go to trial. The pre-trial investigation uncovered details that would have seemed implausible if they weren't all documented in official records. Dennis's personnel file read like a case study in how institutions protect their own, even when the evidence of misconduct is overwhelming. Those 15 excessive force complaints hadn't just been filed and forgotten. They'd been investigated by internal affairs and systematically dismissed, with explanations that all followed the same pattern. Officer acted within departmental guidelines. Complainant's version of events could not be substantiated. Officer's judgment was reasonable given perceived threat. But when Keisha's team interviewed the complainants directly, a very different story emerged. Marcus Washington, a high school teacher, had been stopped for matching the description of a suspect while walking to his car after parent-teacher conferences. Dennis had thrown him against a wall hard enough to crack 2 ribs, and the investigation had concluded that Marcus's injuries were consistent with necessary use of force to secure a non-compliant subject. The fact that Marcus had been compliant from the first moment, had immediately provided his ID, and had been released without charges after 10 minutes was noted in the report, but not considered relevant. Jennifer O'Farah, a pediatric surgeon, had been detained in a hospital parking lot because Dennis thought her scrubs looked suspicious, and her car was too expensive for that neighborhood. She'd spent 40 minutes in handcuffs in her own parking space while Dennis ran her plates and registration, searched her vehicle without consent, and questioned whether her medical credentials were legitimate. The complaint she filed described the incident as humiliating and racist. Internal Affairs found that Dennis had exercised appropriate caution when confronted with unusual circumstances. The pattern went on for pages. 13 people of color, mostly women, mostly in situations where they were existing in spaces someone like Dennis decided they didn't belong. And in every single case, the institution had chosen to believe Dennis's narrative over theirs, had accepted his characterization of threat even when no actual threat existed, had treated his judgment as reliable despite mountain evidence that his judgment was built on bias. The city knew, Keisha said during a meeting with Selena and her legal team. They knew he had a problem, and they kept putting him in situations where he could keep harming people. That's not just negligence, that's deliberate indifference. That's a constitutional violation. But the investigation into Diane Kowalski revealed something even more disturbing. Beyond her 3 documented 911 calls, there were dozens of incidents recorded in her neighborhood watch group's private Facebook page. Posts about suspicious vehicles that turned out to be Amazon delivery drivers. Warnings about unknown individuals that were actually residents' family members visiting. Photos taken surreptitiously of people walking through her neighborhood. Always people of color, always accompanied by some variation of keep an eye out or seemed out of place. The group had 347 members, and the posts showed an ecosystem of mutual reinforcement, where Diane's suspicions were constantly validated by others who shared her biases. When someone would occasionally push back, maybe we shouldn't assume everyone we don't recognize as a threat, they'd be shut down or removed from the group entirely. Diane had become, in essence, the unofficial sheriff of her community, appointed by no one, but empowered by everyone who clicked like on her posts. This is organized harassment, Keisha's junior associate said, scrolling through the Facebook archive they subpoenaed. This is a group of people who've decided they get to police who belongs in public spaces, and they're doing it purely based on race. Can we use it in court? Selena asked. All of it, Keisha confirmed. It establishes a pattern of behavior. It shows that what happened to you wasn't an isolated mistake of poor judgment. It was the predictable outcome of someone who'd been profiling people for years, and finally married someone with the authority to act on her prejudices. As the trial date approached, the evidence pile grew. The body cam footage was analyzed frame by frame by
Keisha's expert witnesses, who pointed out how Dennis's hand moved toward his weapon when Selena questioned him, how his body language showed escalation rather than de-escalation, how every choice he made was the opposite of what de-escalation training teaches officers to do. Tasha, the sales associate who'd been too scared to intervene, agreed to testify after Keisha assured her that her initial hesitation wouldn't be held against her. Her testimony would establish that Selena had been acting completely normally, that there was no indication of theft or suspicious behavior. The only reason Dennis got involved was because his wife called him. Marcus's testimony would establish the company hierarchy, prove that Selena was exactly who she said she was, and document the standard operating procedure for her unannounced quality checks that made her presence in the store not just normal, but expected. And Selena herself would testify about the experience of being arrested in her own business, about the marks the handcuffs left on her wrists for days afterward, about the nightmares she'd been having since September, where she was back in that store, back in those cuffs, unable to make anyone believe who she was. The jury's going to see you as credible, Keisha told her during trial prep. You're articulate, successful, sympathetic. You're exactly the kind of person who makes juries uncomfortable when they realize how easily this could happen to anyone. That's what we're building toward, making them understand that if this could happen to you, a CEO with resources and connections and power, imagine what's happening to people who don't have those advantages. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in February, 7 months after the arrest. The courthouse was packed with journalists, civil rights advocates, and people who'd followed the case since the body cam footage had been leaked online and gone viral. Dennis and Diane sat at the defense table, both of them looking smaller somehow than they had in that boutique, their certainty replaced by the grim realization that they were about to be held accountable in a way they'd never experienced before. The prosecution played the body cam footage on the first day, and the courtroom went silent as they watched Selena in her camel coat, watched Dennis dismiss her explanation, watched the moment the handcuffs closed, watched Marcus burst through the door and scream, "That's the CEO!" The timestamp 2018-09-02-8-20-25-47 would become the most cited piece of evidence, the moment when everything changed, recorded in perfect digital clarity for everyone to see. When it was Selena's turn to testify, she told her story without drama or embellishment, just the facts of what happened and how it felt to be criminalized in a space she'd built with her own money and vision. She showed the photographs of the marks on her wrists. She described the business she'd built over 12 years, and she looked directly at the jury when she said, "I want to be clear about something. This isn't just about me. This is about every person of color who's ever been followed in a store, questioned in their own neighborhood, treated like a criminal for the crime of existing in a space where someone decided they didn't belong. I have resources to fight back. Most people don't. That's what this trial is really about." The defense tried to paint Dennis as a dedicated officer who'd made a reasonable mistake, tried to characterize Diane's call as a concerned citizen doing her civic duty. But every time they tried to establish that narrative, the prosecution would introduce another complaint, another 911 transcript, another Facebook post, another piece of the pattern that showed this wasn't a mistake at all. It was a feature of how they'd both been operating for years. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, and when they came back, they'd found Dennis Kowalski guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing 3 weeks later was packed again, but this time the energy in the courtroom was different. Dennis Kowalski stood before the judge in a civilian suit, his 17-year career in law enforcement already over, his pension already forfeit, facing the reality that his assumptions had consequences that extended beyond his own life. "Mr. Kowalski," the judge began, her voice carrying that particular weight that comes with imposing a sentence that's meant to send a message beyond just one case. "The evidence presented in this trial revealed a pattern of behavior that is antithetical to everything law enforcement should represent. You were entrusted with power, and you abused that power repeatedly, targeting people of color based on nothing more than your own prejudices. This court finds that your actions were not the result of a split-second decision or an honest mistake, but rather the culmination of years of unchecked bias. I'm sentencing you to 8 years in state prison on the charges of official misconduct and false imprisonment, to be served consecutively. You'll be eligible for parole after 6 years, provided you complete racial bias counseling and demonstrate genuine understanding of the harm you've caused." 8 years. The number hung in the air, heavier than the actual time it represented, because everyone in that courtroom understood what it meant. Dennis Kowalski, who'd spent 17 years carrying a badge and building a life on the assumption that his judgment was infallible, would spend the next 8 years learning what it felt like to be on the other side of that power imbalance. Diane sat in the gallery, her face blank, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't facing criminal charges, but the civil suit was still pending, and the social consequences had already started to accumulate. Within a week of the arrest going public, she'd been asked to resign from her position on the board of a local charity that worked with at-risk youth. The irony of a woman who profiled black people being on a board that primarily served black children hadn't been lost on the other board members, and they'd made it clear her presence was no longer welcome. Her country club membership had been suspended pending review, which everyone understood was a polite way of saying she'd been kicked out. The Neighborhood Watch Facebook group had been shut down after their archives became part of the public trial record, and several members had been doxxed by online activists who'd spent hours combing through posts looking for other instances of racial profiling. Diane's name had been trending on Twitter for 3 days. Her photo circulated with captions like, "This is what racism looks like," and "Karen's husband goes to prison." She tried to apologize publicly through a statement her lawyer had prepared, something about misunderstanding and never intending harm, but it had been met with universal skepticism. You don't accidentally call the police on someone because of their race. You don't accidentally track them through mirrors and hide behind clothing racks and decide they don't belong. Those are choices, and the public had decided that Diane's choices reflected exactly who she was. But the civil suit was where the real accountability happened. The city of New York, facing overwhelming evidence of Dennis's pattern of misconduct and their own failure to address it despite years of complaints, decided to settle rather than risk a jury trial. The settlement amount was $700,000, paid from the city's self-insurance fund, taxpayer money essentially, which meant that Dennis's misconduct had cost the public twice, once in the harm he caused, and again in the money required to make it right. Selena had pushed for the settlement to include more than just money. She demanded policy changes, mandatory bias training for all officers, a civilian review board with actual teeth, and a public audit of internal affairs investigations into racial profiling. The city, eager to close the case before it generated more negative publicity, agreed to all of it.
The settlement paperwork included a clause requiring the police department to issue a public apology and acknowledgement that Selena had been wronged, that the arrest was unjustified, and that the department was committed to ensuring it never happened again. The apology was read at a press conference, and Selena stood at the podium while the police commissioner stumbled through words that had clearly been written by lawyers trying to accept responsibility without admitting too much liability. It was uncomfortable and awkward, and probably meaningless in terms of actual change, but it was also public record, videotaped and archived, something that couldn't be taken back later. But what Selena did with the settlement money was where the real legacy began. Instead of keeping it, she didn't need it. After all, she was already a millionaire. She used it to establish the Equality in Commerce Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting minority shoppers from discrimination and profiling. The foundation provided legal support for people who experienced what Selena had experienced but lacked her resources to fight back. It funded bias training for retail employees. It created a hotline where people could report incidents of racial profiling in commercial spaces. And it partnered with businesses that wanted to actively combat discrimination, creating a certification program that let consumers know which stores had committed to equal treatment. The launch of the foundation got almost as much publicity as the trial had. Selena was interviewed by Forbes again, by CNN, by local news stations, by podcasts and blogs, and every outlet that wanted to cover the story of how she turned violation into activism. She was careful in those interviews to always bring the focus back to the broader issue, to make it clear that her case was just one example of a problem that affected millions of people every day. I was lucky, she said, during an NPR interview that would later be cited in academic papers about racial profiling in commercial spaces. I had money, connections, a paper trail that proved who I was. But what about the person who doesn't have those things? What about the teenager who gets followed in a store and humiliated, but has no recourse because they can't afford a lawyer? What about the person who gets arrested and loses their job before the charges are even dismissed? Those are choices, and the foundation is trying to help those people. Those are the stories that don't make the news, that happen every day. The foundation grew quickly, funded by additional donations from people who saw themselves in Selena's story, from corporations trying to improve their own track records on diversity, from foundations that supported civil rights work. Within a year, they'd handled over 200 cases, ranging from teenagers kicked out of stores for looking suspicious to professionals detained by security for matching descriptions that were transparently racial.
And Nouveau Luxe thrived. The publicity from the case had been double-edged, horrifying in its revelation of what Selena had endured, but also generating massive awareness of her brand. Sales increased by 40% in the 6 months following the trial, partly because people wanted to support a business owner who had faced injustice with such dignity, partly because the media coverage had introduced her brand to markets she'd never reached before. She opened 2 more locations, one in Atlanta and one in Chicago, and she made sure that every employee at every location received extensive training on bias, profiling, and how to intervene if they saw a customer being treated unfairly. She also implemented a policy that any customer complaint about another customer's suspicious behavior will be investigated by management before any action was taken. A safeguard designed to prevent someone like Diane from weaponizing store security against people they decided didn't belong. But perhaps the most unexpected legacy came from the body cam footage itself. The video had been entered into evidence during the trial, which made it part of public record, and within hours of the verdict being announced, it had been uploaded to every social media platform, shared millions of times, and turned into a teaching tool in law schools and police academies and civil rights organizations. The timestamps 2018, 09, 08, 2025, 47 became shorthand for the moment when someone's prejudice was exposed, when assumptions met reality, when power had to acknowledge its own abuse. Selena herself had complicated feelings about the video's virality. On one hand, it was proof, undeniable evidence that vindicated her completely. On the other hand, it meant that the worst moment of her life was now permanently accessible, replayed over and over by people who would never know her as anything other than the woman in handcuffs in her own store. She had to disable comments on her social media accounts after the trial, because people kept tagging her in discussions of the video, kept asking her to relive the trauma, kept turning her violation into content. But she also understood that the video's visibility was part of why the case had mattered beyond just her own experience. Without that footage, it would have been word against word. Her accusation against Dennis's denial, another incident that got buried in paperwork and forgotten. The body cam had made it undeniable, and that undeniability had forced accountability that rarely happened in cases like this. 2 years after the arrest, Selena stood in the window of her Madison Avenue flagship, the same window where she'd stood dozens of times before, looking out at the city that had both violated and vindicated her. The store was busy. It was always busy now, and she watched customers move through the space, picking up dresses, examining quality, trying on pieces that made them feel beautiful. Most of them had no idea about the history of this particular location, didn't know that the marble floor they walked on was where expensive dresses had once fallen during an unjust arrest. And that was fine. That was maybe even the point. The foundation's logo was displayed in the window next to the Nouveau Luxe branding, a partnership between business and activism that Selena had decided would define the rest of her career. She wasn't just selling clothes anymore. She was selling the idea that everyone deserved to exist in commercial spaces without fear, that shopping shouldn't come with the risk of being profiled, that the assumption of belonging should be universal. Her phone buzzed with a notification from Marcus, another successful quality check at the Philadelphia location. Everything up to standard, no incidents. She smiled and texted back a thumbs up, then turned away from the window to help a customer who was examining the new collection. A woman who looked at Selena and saw only the founder of a brand she admired. Not knowing that 3 years ago, someone had looked at Selena and seen only a threat, the story could have ended differently. In most cases, it did end differently, with apologies that changed nothing, settlements that included non-disclosure agreements, officers who faced no consequences beyond a note in their personnel file. But this story ended with accountability, with policy changes, with a foundation that would help thousands of people, with a public acknowledgement that what happened was wrong and couldn't be allowed to happen again. It ended with Selena Caldwell standing in her store, her empire intact, her reputation stronger than before, her commitment to justice turned into action that would outlast the viral video and the trending hashtags and the think pieces about racial profiling in America. It ended with her building something that meant the next person who stood where she stood in handcuffs might have somewhere to turn, someone to call, some recourse beyond just accepting that this is how the world works. It ended with her refusing to let that moment define her, but also refusing to pretend it hadn't happened. It ended with her transforming violation into power, assumption into accountability, that 8 seconds of body cam footage into a movement that was bigger than any one person's experience. It ended with her winning, not just the lawsuit or the settlement or the public apology, but something more fundamental, the right to exist in her own space without question, without suspicion, without someone deciding she didn't belong. That was the real verdict, the one that mattered more than any jury could deliver. And as she moved through her store that afternoon, helping customers and checking inventory and doing the small tasks that running a business required, she carried that victory with her, not as something to prove anymore, but as something she'd already proven, irrevocably and forever, recorded in perfect digital clarity for everyone to see. The timestamp, 2018-09-08-2025-47, would always mark the moment when everything changed, but it no longer marked the moment Selena was victimized. It marked the moment she became unstoppable.